"You don't belong here, you poor little thing, I know gold diggers like you," my mother said before I even had a chance to step fully into the living room with Amara at my side. Her words hit like ice water, sharp and unrelenting, freezing the cheerful atmosphere I had imagined for this first visit. I shifted uncomfortably, feeling my palms grow clammy. Amara didn't flinch. She stood tall, eyes steady on my mother, and that gave me a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. I knew then that she wasn't the kind to crumble under verbal assault, but I also realized how deep my mother's venom ran. I took a breath, trying to smooth over the tension like I always had. "Mom, please, this is Amara, my fiancé. I want you to meet her properly," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But my mother's sharp gaze didn't soften. She leaned back in her armchair, hands folded over her pristine dress, the way she always did when she felt she was in complete control. "I know exactly what she wants, Ease. Money, status, someone to keep her comfortable while she does nothing for herself. You're making a huge mistake." Her tone wasn't angry, exactly, it was calm, almost surgical in the way it cut. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't reply. I could feel her assessing my mother, quietly noting every detail, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I'd been afraid of this moment for years. My mother had always had an iron grip on me, and I had never dared defy her. But this was different. This was the woman I loved standing in front of someone who had built her life on intimidation and judgment. My stomach churned. I wanted to say something more, to defend Amara, but my voice stuck somewhere in my throat. We moved further into the house, and my mother began a tour that felt less like hospitality and more like a subtle interrogation. Every family portrait, every display of wealth, she used to emphasize my heritage, my privilege, and, implicitly, the trap she believed Amara had walked into. "This is where your father used to meet clients," she said, her eyes flicking toward Amara, "though I suppose someone like you wouldn't understand the kind of work that builds empires." I winced but kept my composure. Amara, surprisingly, smiled faintly, nodding politely, and I caught myself envying her calm. At dinner, the tension escalated. My mother's questions weren't polite conversation, they were tests. "What do you do, Amara? And tell me, who is your family? I like to know exactly who I'm dealing with." Amara answered without hesitation, describing her career, her family background, her ambitions, and even her hobbies. I noticed how my mother's eyes narrowed slightly at every detail, scanning for inconsistencies, as if she expected a slip. I had watched her do this before with friends, girlfriends, even casual acquaintances. She had a way of making anyone feel exposed, small, inadequate. I tried to interject occasionally, to clarify or soften, but my mother brushed me off with a wave of her hand, as though I was a minor irritation. "Ease, don't defend her too much. I can see right through her," she said, then leaned back, folding her fingers together. I felt a spike of anger, but pushed it down. I couldn't ruin Amara's first impression, or mine, for that matter. Instead, I focused on keeping my tone neutral, keeping the conversation moving. "Mom, she's a professional. She's accomplished and independent. You'll see for yourself soon enough." My mother chuckled dryly, not in amusement but in that patronizing way that made me feel both small and responsible. The evening dragged on with my mother continuing her quiet barrage. Every compliment I tried to offer Amara was met with a cold remark or a pointed glance from my mother. "You're very charming, but I still worry about people who come for what they think is a life of luxury," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. I wanted to explode, to tell her to stop, but I didn't. Instead, I watched Amara. She stayed composed, her eyes soft but alert, noting every detail of my mother's expressions and words. There was intelligence in her observation, a subtle understanding that this wasn't just about her, it was about years of family dynamics that I'd barely begun to navigate. At one point, Amara asked a question about a painting on the wall, an old piece of abstract art my mother had insisted was a family heirloom. My mother's response was sharp, almost defensive. "That? It's been in the family for generations. Not that someone like you would understand its value or significance." Amara tilted her head slightly, thoughtful, and replied, "I can see why it's meaningful to your family. The colors are bold, confident. It reminds me of resilience." I caught a flicker of something in my mother's eyes. Was it surprise? Or irritation? I wasn't sure. Later, while clearing the plates, I tried to speak quietly to Amara. "Are you okay?" I whispered, watching her nod without breaking eye contact with my mother. Her resilience gave me a flicker of hope, but it also made me painfully aware of how much I had allowed my mother to dominate my life. This was the moment I had feared for so long, and yet, seeing Amara's composure, I realized maybe it was finally time to consider standing up not just for her, but for myself. Before we retired for the evening, my mother pulled me aside, her tone lower but no less cutting. "Ease, I'm just looking out for you. Don't let this woman fool you. I've seen it before. Don't think I won't intervene if she takes advantage of you." I swallowed hard, realizing the depth of her conviction. It wasn't mere malice. It was fear disguised as authority, a lifetime of insecurity and vigilance shaped by her experiences. I nodded, pretending to acquiesce, while internally, I felt a mix of guilt, frustration, and an awakening sense that I couldn't let fear control my choices anymore. That night, as Amara and I settled into the guest room, she finally spoke in a softer voice. "Your mother, she's intense." I chuckled weakly, rubbing my face. "That's one way to put it. You've got more patience than I do." She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'll survive. But tell me, do you always let her have this much power over you?" I looked away, feeling a lump in my throat. I wanted to say yes, but it was more complicated. Fear, respect, have it all wrapped tightly in my sense of family loyalty. Before sleep claimed us, I lay awake thinking of my mother's words, of Amara's composure, and of the gnawing sense that something had shifted. For the first time, I realized that love, the kind I felt for Amara, wasn't supposed to feel like a battleground. Maybe standing up for her and for myself wasn't just a choice. Maybe it was inevitable. The next morning began quietly, though the air was thick with unspoken tension. Breakfast was a delicate affair. My mother moved with her usual precision, arranging plates and silverware in a way that seemed more ceremonial than practical, while Amara sat across from me, observing everything with that calm, measuring gaze that I was starting to admire more than ever. She didn't speak much, but her eyes caught every subtle motion, every fleeting expression on my mother's face. I wondered what she was thinking, and I realized that, for the first time, I wasn't the only one silently trying to read my mother. As my mother discussed the day's plans, appointments, errands, and a seemingly endless list of social obligations, Amara asked gentle, thoughtful questions that revealed her awareness of the family's dynamics without directly confronting anyone. "It seems you take a lot of pride in maintaining family traditions," she said. My mother's lips pressed together in a thin line, a flicker of something like surprise crossing her face before she answered with her usual measured tone. "Of course. Respecting the past is essential. Some people don't understand that." Amara nodded, her expression neutral, but I caught the spark of quiet intelligence, the way she was weaving together the inconsistencies in my mother's words and behavior. I noticed small things I had never truly paid attention to before. The way my mother's eyes lingered on certain objects, the tension in her shoulders when discussing money, the subtle shifts in her voice when she thought no one was listening. Amara seemed to notice them too, though she remained polite and composed. I watched as she sipped her coffee, her gaze flicking between the ornate furniture and the family portraits lining the walls. "You've got a lot of history here," she said softly. "I can tell some of it hasn't been easy." My mother's sharp eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, and Amara continued without pressing further, respecting boundaries yet clearly making her observations. Later, when my mother excused herself to take a phone call, Amara leaned slightly toward me. "Ease, there's something off, isn't there? Something you're not telling me about your family." Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial, but not accusatory. I swallowed hard, torn between wanting to confide everything and feeling protective of my family's secrets. "It's complicated," I admitted. "There are things you wouldn't understand right now." Amara's hand brushed mine lightly. "I want to understand," she said simply. That moment, that quiet trust, reminded me of why I loved her. She wasn't here for money or for drama, she genuinely cared, and her patience and empathy were starting to unravel the tight grip my mother had always had on me. Throughout the day, I became increasingly aware of Amara's quiet, investigative nature. She would ask seemingly innocent questions about our family history, past decisions, and even my childhood experiences, and she would watch my mother's reactions closely. Sometimes, my mother would stiffen, her usual composure faltering for a split second before she masked it with a practiced smile. Amara noticed every flicker, every micro-expression. It was uncanny how she could gather so much from so little, and I realized she was silently piecing together the puzzle of our lives, our secrets, and my mother's motivations. By midday, I began to notice inconsistencies in my mother's stories, details that didn't quite align. Amara would raise an eyebrow subtly, and I could feel the tension in the room shift. My mother had always been controlling, yes, but there was something deeper, something that hinted at her own vulnerabilities, her own fears, and perhaps a past betrayal that had hardened her heart. Amara's presence seemed to expose these cracks without confrontation. I watched as my mother grew slightly defensive when Amara mentioned charity work, volunteering, and integrity in relationships, as if she felt accused or challenged indirectly. We went for a walk in the family garden later that afternoon. The sun was soft, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, and for a moment, it felt like a sanctuary. Amara walked slightly ahead, observing the flowers, the paths, the sculptures, while I struggled to match my mother's outward composure with my internal chaos. I had loved this garden as a child, but now it felt suffocating, each corner a reminder of the hierarchy I had never dared to challenge. Amara bent to examine a small patch of roses. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but some of these have been pruned too tightly. They need room to grow." Her words resonated beyond the garden, a metaphor that I could feel deep in my chest. Later, over tea, the tension between Amara and my mother subtly escalated, though still veiled by politeness. My mother asked pointed questions about my future plans, inheritance, and career ambitions, framing them as casual interest, but clearly testing Amara's motives. Amara's responses were measured, honest, and respectful, yet I could see my mother's irritation bubbling beneath the surface. She frowned at certain answers, tilted her head in disbelief at others, and I felt the weight of decades of manipulation and control pressing down in that room. Amara's presence, calm and assertive, created a strange mirror reflecting both the truth of my feelings and the shadow of my mother's fears. By evening, the subtle clues Amara had been picking up began to coalesce into an understanding of my family I hadn't fully articulated myself. She would make brief comments, small observations, never direct confrontations, that made my mother tighten up. "It seems some decisions here have caused more pain than intended," she said once, almost casually. My mother's fork paused midair, and I caught the briefest flash of vulnerability in her eyes before the shield went back up. I felt pride in Amara's intelligence and grace, but also a growing anxiety that my mother was powerful, and I was starting to realize that love alone might not be enough to overcome years of entrenched control. That night, as we sat in the living room after dinner, Amara leaned back and spoke softly, almost to herself. People often protect themselves with anger or suspicion when they've been hurt before. Sometimes it looks like cruelty, but it's really fear. I felt her glance at me, and I understood she was talking about my mother, but also hinting at a lesson for me, to see beyond the surface, to trust in her love, and to recognize the difference between genuine threat and inherited bitterness. I felt a deep sense of clarity I hadn't had before. Amara wasn't just surviving my mother's scrutiny, she was quietly decoding it, preparing for the truth, and teaching me to do the same. I lay awake that night, thinking about the inconsistencies, the hidden motives, and the subtle power plays I had never noticed. Amara's calm presence had shifted something inside me. I began to see my mother not just as an obstacle, but as a human being with fears and insecurities, just as I saw Amara not as a stranger or a potential gold digger, but as the woman I loved, intelligent, patient, and fearless in her empathy. The day had been exhausting, mentally and emotionally, but also enlightening. I realized that the quiet observations, the careful listening, and the subtle truth-seeking were building the foundation for a confrontation I had long avoided, a confrontation that might finally reshape my understanding of family, love, and loyalty. The next morning, I felt a strange mix of determination and anxiety. The tension that had been simmering over the past 2 days needed a release, and I could no longer ignore the reality. I had to defend Amara, and in doing so, I would be confronting my mother in a way I never had before. Breakfast was quiet, the silence thick, broken only by the soft clinking of cutlery against porcelain. My mother seemed aware that a confrontation was inevitable. She looked at me with that piercing gaze, the one that had guided, controlled, and sometimes frightened me all my life. I took a deep breath, trying to summon every ounce of courage. Amara, as always, was calm beside me, her hand brushing mine briefly across the table. That small gesture gave me courage. I realized that she had never doubted me, never questioned my intentions, and in that quiet moment, I felt a surge of clarity. I was no longer a boy under my mother's thumb. I was a man capable of defending his choices, and more importantly, the woman he loved. "Mom," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "there's something we need to talk about." My mother raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing together in that familiar, measured line. I could feel the weight of years pressing down on me, but I pressed forward anyway. "I've been silent for too long, letting your fears and assumptions dictate my life. You called Amara a gold digger, accusing her of intentions she doesn't have. But I need you to know the truth," I said, glancing at Amara, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. "Amara isn't here for money. She isn't here to take advantage of anything. She loves me. That's the reality. And I won't let anyone, even you, make me doubt that love." My mother's eyes flashed, a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and anger, but I could also see something softer flicker beneath the surface, perhaps recognition, perhaps guilt. Amara's voice joined mine, gentle but firm. "Mrs. Chukwuma, I understand your concern. I know it's difficult to see someone new in your son's life. But I promise you, my intentions are genuine. I'm not here for wealth or comfort. I love ease, and I want a life built on trust, respect, and partnership, not on status or money." Her words were measured, honest, and I could feel the impact immediately. My mother stiffened, clearly wrestling with emotions she had buried for decades. I continued, more confident now. "Mom, I also need to tell you something about the family finances and history. You've always been bitter about past betrayals, about mistakes made by people we trusted. I understand that. But projecting that bitterness onto Amara isn't fair. She is not the person you think she is." I laid out, carefully but plainly, the truth about our family's finances, our past challenges, and the reasons my mother had developed her harshness and suspicion over time. Each revelation was a small crack in the armor she had built around herself. Amara remained silent, watching my mother carefully. Her presence had always been a calm mirror, reflecting truths without judgment, and I could see it working. My mother's fingers tightened around her teacup, her jaw tense. She wanted to respond, to argue, to dismiss, but Amara's gaze held her in place, not with force, but with a quiet insistence on honesty. "I've always feared betrayal," my mother said finally, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. "People I trusted, people I loved, they disappointed me. I see now how that fear has colored my judgment." I felt a mixture of relief and cautious hope. I took her hand gently. "Mom, I love you, and I want you to be part of our life. But I also need you to see Amara for who she really is. Not for what you fear she might be. She is kind, intelligent, and she loves me for me, not for anything else." There was a pause, a long, suspended moment, before my mother finally exhaled, a deep, weary sound, as if decades of suspicion were slowly being released. Amara smiled softly. "I don't expect instant trust, Mrs. Chukwuma. But I hope we can build it, step by step. I'm here for ease, and by extension, for you too, if you allow it." My mother looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without judgment. Her eyes softened, and a faint smile touched her lips, almost shyly. It was the first sign that she might see beyond her fears and finally accept that Amara's love was genuine. I realized then that the confrontation had done more than defend Amara. It had shifted the balance in our family dynamic. My mother had been a tower of control and fear, but now there was space for understanding. There was room for empathy, even if it came slowly. Amara's patience and integrity had forced that space open. And for the first time, I felt the possibility that love could exist in our family without being tested, without constant suspicion, without the weight of old resentments. Later that evening, we all sat together in the living room. The atmosphere was lighter, though still cautious. My mother spoke softly about family memories, about lessons learned, about fears she had carried for years. Amara listened, asking gentle questions, affirming my mother's experiences without dismissing them. It was a delicate dance, but one that began to feel natural, a conversation replacing conflict. I watched them, my chest swelling with pride and gratitude. My mother was opening, slowly, and Amara's steady presence was guiding her without force, without confrontation, just with honesty and grace. And Amara with a mixture of vulnerability and acceptance. I may not fully trust or understand everything yet, she admitted, but I see your love, ease. And Amara, I see your sincerity. I may need time, but perhaps. I was wrong to judge so harshly. Relief washed over me. I reached for Amara's hand, and she squeezed it gently. Thank you, I whispered, both to her and to my mother. This means more than you know. Amara leaned closer, her voice soft. It's okay, Ease. You've got this. And so do I. Love isn't about fear, it's about trust, and we're building it right now. My mother nodded quietly, and I realized that for the first time in years, the walls of suspicion and control had begun to crumble. The twist wasn't just that Amara wasn't after money, it was that my mother's fears, her insecurities, and past betrayals had been shaping her judgment all along. Recognizing that, and seeing it dismantled through patience, honesty, and love, was the most powerful lesson of all. As the night deepened, I felt a sense of closure that had been impossible before. Amara's love had proven genuine, my mother's understanding had begun, and I had finally found my voice in the family I had once feared to challenge. The day had started with judgment and suspicion, but it ended with hope, empathy, and the quiet realization that love, when defended with courage and truth, could overcome even the most entrenched fears. I looked at Amara, and in that moment, I knew we could face anything together. Moral lesson. Love is strongest when courage meets truth. Trust cannot flourish where fear dominates, and family ties grow richer when honesty and patience guide them. Misunderstandings and judgments often hide past pain, but gentle observation, empathy, and clear communication can bridge the deepest divides. Stand up for those you care about, yet remain open to understanding the fears that shape others. Real love is patient, persistent, and unwavering not because it avoids conflict, but because it chooses connection over control. When hearts meet with sincerity, even the most guarded walls can open, and relationships can thrive in authenticity and respect.